In May 2017, in Douglas County, Oregon, 23-year-old Emily Carter stood beside a fence line and watched another truck unload a mountain of pale wooden cylinders onto her family's struggling farm. The driver called them peeler cores. The Veneer plant called them waste. Her neighbors called them junk. Emily called them nothing at all. She simply watched the load tumble down, one round piece after another, until it covered nearly half an acre. She had $4,800 left in her checking account, a mortgage payment due in 9 days, and no idea how she was going to keep the farm through winter. Yet she kept staring at the wood. Emily was not the kind of farmer people noticed at county meetings. At 23, she wore faded work jeans, rubber boots, a canvas jacket, and the same brown gloves until the fingertips separated. Her dark blonde hair was usually tied beneath an old baseball cap. She spoke quietly, worked early, and had developed a habit of studying things before deciding what they were worth. That habit had been taught to her by her grandfather. Her grandfather, Walter Carter, had spent 41 years repairing logging equipment and farming a small orchard outside Sutherland. He had died 2 winters earlier, leaving Emily 73 acres, an aging farmhouse, 3 dozen neglected pear trees, a weathered barn, and debts nobody in the family had realized were quite so large. The Farmall M in the barn had belonged to him, too. Its red paint had faded almost pink on the hood, and the starter sometimes needed 3 attempts before the engine caught. Walter had bought it used in 1968 and had once told Emily that a machine did not become useless simply because everyone stopped looking at it. Emily remembered that sentence whenever the bank called. The Veneer plant began bringing the peeler cores to her property when she was 13. At first, her grandfather had accepted them because the plant needed somewhere to put the material, and Walter needed cheap wood for a few projects around the farm. The arrangement was supposed to last 1 summer. Then another truck came, and another. 10 years passed. By 2017, the piles had become part of the landscape. The cores came from Douglas fir logs after rotary lathes stripped them into thin sheets for plywood production. What remained was a central cylinder, sometimes 8 inches across, sometimes smaller, with bark removed and the grain running almost perfectly straight. Most people saw firewood. Emily had begun noticing something else. The pieces were remarkably uniform. That morning, while the truck driver climbed back into his cab, Emily crouched beside the newest pile and picked up one of the cylinders. It was dry, heavy, straight. She tapped one end against her boot. A clean wooden sound answered. Her neighbor, Ray Madsen, was leaning against his pickup across the road. "You're actually keeping those things?" Emily looked over. "For now." Ray laughed. "For 10 years. Emily said nothing. Ray shook his head. "Your grandfather knew how to farm. You should have sold this place." That sentence stayed with her longer than she wanted it to. The bank had already warned her that the farm was not producing enough income. The pear orchard had been neglected. Hay prices had been unpredictable. The old irrigation pump consumed more electricity every summer. A contractor had estimated that replacing the farm's fencing would cost more than Emily had in savings. And every week, another truck brought another pile of wooden cores. That afternoon, Emily walked the property with a measuring tape. She measured the fence posts first, then the cores. She wrote numbers in a small notebook. 6 feet, 7 feet, 8 feet. She measured diameter. She checked the grain. She examined the end for splitting. By sunset, the notebook contained 17 measurements and 1 sentence. They are already shaped like posts. Emily stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she crossed it out. She did not trust ideas that arrived too quickly. The next morning, she drove to the county office. A county agricultural inspector named Harold Pierce met her at the counter. Harold was 58, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, and famous around Douglas County for believing that every farming problem had already been solved by somebody older. Emily explained what she wanted to know. Could untreated peeler cores be used as fence posts? Harold listened. Then he smiled. Technically, wood is wood. Emily waited. But that doesn't mean you can sell anything that looks like a post. I know. You're thinking about selling them? Emily nodded. Harold leaned back. To who? I don't know yet. That answer made him laugh. Not cruelly. Worse. He laughed like the idea was too small to deserve an argument. "Emily, ranchers don't buy problems," he said. "They buy posts that last." She thanked him and left. Outside, she sat in her truck for nearly 5 minutes without starting it. She could have gone home embarrassed. Instead, she drove to a ranch supply store 40 miles away. There, she walked between stacks of commercial fence posts. Some were pressure-treated. Some were peeled roundwood. Some were split. She looked at their prices. Then she looked at the diameter of the cheaper ones. Her eyes narrowed. When she returned home, the first thing she did was walk back to the pile. She chose 20 cores. Then another 20. She dragged them beneath the barn's old roof and lined them against the wall. For the first time, the pile looked less like garbage. It looked like inventory. But Emily still had a problem. The wood was untreated. And Douglas County rain did not forgive untreated wood. That evening, she called Walter's old friend, a retired orchard grower named Frank Bell. Frank answered on the fourth ring. Emily asked him about wood preservation. There was silence. Then Frank asked, "Why?" Emily looked through the barn doorway at the enormous pile glowing pale gold beneath the setting sun. "Because I think Grandpa left me something I haven't understood yet." Frank did not laugh. He simply said, "Bring me one tomorrow." The next morning, Emily carried a single peeler core into Frank's workshop. He turned it over twice. Then he stopped. His expression changed. "What?" Frank ran his thumb along the grain. "Where did this come from?" "The Veneer plant." He looked at her. "Emily, these aren't ordinary scraps." She waited. Frank walked toward an old shelf filled with notebooks. He pulled down one covered in dust. And when he opened it, Emily saw a drawing of a round wooden post that looked almost exactly like the piece in her hands. Frank looked at the drawing, then at Emily. "I've been waiting 30 years to see somebody make these properly." Emily felt the first real spark of hope she had felt since inheriting the farm. But before she could ask what he meant, Frank turned another page, and the name written there belonged to the same Veneer company that had been dumping those cores on Emily's land for 10 years. Frank Bell closed a notebook before Emily could read the rest. "What does that name mean?" she asked. Frank looked at the peeler core lying across his workbench. "It means your grandfather wasn't the first person to notice what these things could become." Emily waited. Frank turned the notebook around. Inside was an old sketch from 1989, showing a round wooden post, a shallow groove cut around its upper end, and a series of measurements written in Walter Carter's handwriting. Emily recognized the handwriting immediately. Her grandfather had experimented with the cores, but he had never told her. "Why didn't he build them?" she asked. Frank rubbed his jaw. He tried. "What happened?" "The plant wasn't interested." "That doesn't answer the question." Frank gave her a tired smile. "Your grandfather wanted to prove the wood could replace expensive fence posts. The plant wanted the material gone. They weren't looking at the same thing." Emily stared at the drawing. "How close did he get?" Frank pointed toward the measurements. "Close enough to scare somebody." That sentence followed Emily home. She spent the afternoon searching the barn. Behind a stack of broken irrigation pipe, she found an old wooden crate with Walter's initials burned into the side. Inside were 11 peeler cores, not random ones. Every piece had been numbered. Emily placed them on the barn floor. Then she noticed something else. Each end had a small pencil mark. A, B, C, D. She searched through Walter's old notebooks until she found a matching page. There were notes about moisture content, diameter, splitting, and something called ground contact. Her grandfather had been testing which cores survive exposure to wet soil. The results were incomplete, but one line had been underlined twice. Heartwood center stays surprisingly stable. Emily read it again, then again. She finally understood what Walter had been studying. The center of the log was not merely leftover material. It was the strongest, most uniform part of the entire tree. But strength alone would not save the farm. Emily needed buyers. So she built the first prototype. She used a Farmall M to pull an old belt-driven woodworking machine out of the barn Walter had used the setup to shape orchard stakes. The machine rattled violently when Emily started it. She shut it down, adjusted the belt. Started again. This time the old engine settled into a low mechanical rumble. Emily fed the first core through. With dust filled the barn, the machine shaved away a thin outer layer, leaving a smooth cylindrical post. When it came out the other side, Emily ran her glove over the surface. It was nearly perfect. She made another, then another. By midnight, she had 12. The next morning, she drove them into the ground along the edge of her pear orchard. No announcement, no photograph, no sales pitch, just posts. Ray Madsen noticed them before lunch. He stopped his truck at the gate. "What are those?" Emily kept tightening wire. "Fence posts." Ray laughed. "You're serious." "Yes." "From the junk pile?" Emily nodded. Ray shook his head. "You're going to lose money on this." Emily hammered another staple into the post. "Maybe." That answer irritated him. He wanted her to defend herself. She didn't. 3 weeks passed. Then the weather changed. Late June brought a string of hot days, followed by a violent storm from the west. Rain hammered the farm for nearly 6 hours. The ground turned soft. Several older fence posts leaned. 2 broke. The new cores did not. Emily noticed something she hadn't expected. The smooth posts had drained quickly after the rain. Their bases remained firm. She pulled one from the ground. The surface was wet. The center was not. That was when she called Frank. He arrived the next morning. He cut one post open. Then he cut an old commercial post beside it. Frank stared at the 2 cross-sections. "There's your difference." Emily looked closer. The old post had several cracks running inward. The peeler core showed almost none. Frank tapped it. "Uniform grain." Emily nodded. "Exactly." "No," Frank said. "Not exactly." He pointed toward the center. "It's not just uniform grain. The lathe removed the outside layers. You're starting with a piece that has already been stripped down to a predictable diameter." Emily felt the idea becoming bigger. But then the bank called. Her payment was late. The farm's insurance renewal was due. The irrigation bill was higher than expected. The prototype fence had survived. The farm had not. That evening, Emily sat at the kitchen table with 3 envelopes in front of her. She had $2,900 left. If she sold the Farmall M, she could make the payment. If she sold the truck, she could cover another bill. If she sold the farm, everything disappeared. She looked through the window. The peeler cores were stacked behind the barn. 10 years of them, thousands of pieces. She suddenly realized something that made her stomach tighten. She did not have a supply problem. She had a processing problem. The next morning, she returned to the Veneer plant. The plant manager, Carl Benton, was a 51-year-old man who had spent most of his career moving timber through machines. Emily asked how many cores they produced each month. Carl looked suspicious. "Why?" "I want to buy them." Carl blinked. "You want to buy our waste?" "Yes." He laughed. "Emily, we've been paying people to take it." "Then sell it to me cheaply." Carl folded his arms. "You couldn't process what we generate." "Probably not." That honesty caught him off guard. "How much do you want?" Emily looked through the plant window. A conveyor carried freshly peeled sheets toward the drying line. Beyond it, hundreds of pale cores were stacked in bins. "Start with enough for 100 posts a week." Carl smiled. "That's not a business." Emily nodded. "Not yet." She left with a truckload of samples. That night, she made her first price sheet. She calculated cutting, sorting, transport, fasteners, labor, preservative treatment, waste. Her first estimate showed a profit of less than $4 per post. Not enough. She nearly abandoned the idea. Then she noticed the biggest expense. Transport. She was hauling finished posts individually. The plant was already sending trucks toward ranch country. Emily began asking a different question. What if the posts travel with existing loads? She called 3 feed stores, 2 ranch supply businesses, 1 fencing contractor. The first said no. The second said maybe. The third asked for 20 samples. Emily delivered them herself. The contractor was a man named Dale Henson. He picked up 1 post, turned it over, looked at the grain, then asked how much. Emily gave him the number. Dale frowned. That cheap? For now. He looked at the post again. I'll put 20 in a pasture. Emily nodded. If they fail, I'll replace them. Dale smiled. You've got nerve. No. She looked toward the truck, carrying the posts. I've got too many of them. Dale laughed. For the first time, Emily did too. But the test pasture belonged to a cattle operation outside Roseburg, and 3 days after the posts went into the ground, the rancher called Emily before sunrise. She answered half asleep. What happened? The rancher said one sentence. You need to come see this. Emily drove through the fog. When she reached the pasture, she expected broken posts. Instead, she saw cattle standing calmly behind a new fence. Every post was still upright, but the rancher wasn't looking at the fence. He was kneeling beside the soil. Emily stepped out of the truck. What are you looking at? He pointed. A thin line of pale wood fibers was visible where one post met the ground. Emily crouched. She touched it. Then she noticed something underneath. The soil around the post was unusually dry. Not dry from lack of rain. Dry in a narrow ring. The rancher looked at her. Why isn't water sitting around these? Emily didn't answer. She had never tested that. And if the post was changing how water moved through the soil, she had just discovered something far more valuable than a cheap fence post. She reached for her notebook, but before she could write anything, Dale Henson arrived and quietly said, Emily, there's somebody in my truck who wants to talk to you. She looked up. The passenger door opened. Harold Pierce, the county agricultural inspector who had laughed at her idea, stepped into the fog, and he was carrying one of Walter Carter's old notebooks. Harold Pierce did not smile this time. He walked across the pasture, holding Walter's notebook against his chest. Emily stood beside the fence, her gloves still covered with dirt. What do you have? Harold looked at the post, then at her. Your grandfather was right about the grain. Emily felt her shoulders tighten. What else? Harold opened the notebook. He tested these cores against treated posts in 1990. Emily stared at the pages. There were measurements, dates, rainfall records, and photographs pasted between handwritten notes. Walter had compared several types of wood under wet Oregon conditions. Some had split, some had rotted, some had warped. The peeler cores had performed differently, not perfectly, but consistently. Harold tapped one line. He never finished the study. Why? Harold hesitated. Because the county changed its fencing recommendations. Emily looked toward the pasture. So he stopped? No. Harold closed the notebook. He ran out of money. The words hit harder than Emily expected. Her grandfather hadn't abandoned the idea because it failed. He had abandoned it because the farm couldn't afford another experiment. Emily looked at the rows of posts. For 10 years, she had watched trucks dump the same material onto her land. Now she wondered whether the farm had been carrying its own answer the entire time. But there was still one problem. Harold pointed toward the pasture. If you're going to sell these, you need to prove they're safe. Emily nodded. I know. You'll need consistent treatment. I know. You'll need testing. I know. Harold looked surprised. You've already thought about this? Emily shook her head. Not enough. That afternoon, she drove to Corvallis with 4 samples in the back of her truck. She spent the next week calling wood testing laboratories. Most wanted larger orders. One wanted samples prepared according to specific dimensions. Another told her the testing would cost more than she could afford. Then an engineer named Susan Keller agreed to look at the material. Susan was 46 and had spent 20 years studying with durability and agricultural structures. She examined Emily's samples without enthusiasm. Then she noticed the grain. Where'd you get these? The Veneer plant. Susan turned the piece over. How many do you have? Emily answered honestly. Probably thousands. Susan looked up. Then you may have a business. It was the first time anyone outside the farm had said it without laughing. But Susan added a condition. You need to stop thinking of these as waste. Emily waited. They're a standardized raw material. That phrase changed everything. Standardized raw material. Not trash. Not leftovers. Not free firewood. A material. Susan explained the technical reason in simple terms. When a large Douglas fir log is peeled on a rotary lathe, the machine removes thin layers from around the entire circumference. The remaining center is relatively uniform compared with irregular branches or naturally crooked pieces of wood. That uniformity doesn't make the cores immortal, but it can make them predictable. Predictability mattered. Fence builders could cut them to consistent lengths. Manufacturers could sort them by diameter. Treatment could be standardized. Transport could be stacked efficiently. Emily understood immediately. The secret wasn't that nature had created magical wood. The secret was that the Veneer plant had already done half the manufacturing. For 10 years, nobody had been looking at the pile correctly. Then the testing bill arrived. $7,840. Emily stared at it. Her checking account held $1,963. She called Susan. "I can't pay that." Susan was quiet. Then, "Don't." Emily frowned. "What?" "Find a partner who need the answer to." That evening, Emily drove back to farm. The rain had returned. Water ran down the barn roof. The old peeler cores sat beneath their tarp. She lifted the tarp. The pile seemed endless. For the first time, it frightened her. There were thousands of dollars of potential sitting there, and thousands of dollars of risk. The following Monday, Emily walked into the local bank. The loan officer was a man named Thomas Reed. Thomas had rejected her expansion request twice. He looked over the proposal. "Post business?" "Yes." "Using veneer waste?" "Yes." He leaned back. "How much are you asking?" $35,000. Thomas stared at her. "You're asking me to lend $35,000 against what the manufacturer doesn't even want." Emily nodded. "That is exactly what I'm asking." Thomas smiled. "I don't think you've understood the problem." Emily looked at him. "I think I understand it better now." That answer ended the meeting. She left without the loan. For 2 days, she considered giving up. Then Dale Henson called. He had installed another 40 posts. His neighbor wanted some. Then another rancher wanted 50. Then a fencing contractor wanted 200. Emily wrote every request into her notebook. By Friday, she had orders for 412 posts. She stared at the number. 412. She could not make that many by herself. So she called Frank. Then she called the Veneer plant. Then Dale. By Monday, 4 people were standing inside Emily's barn. They'd built a crude production line. Sorting table, cutting station, drill press, treatment tank, drying racks. Nothing was sophisticated, but everything had a purpose. The Farmall M powered the old belt system again. Its engine coughed, shook, and settled into familiar rhythm Emily remembered from childhood. She stood beside it for a moment. Her grandfather had used the same machine to work this land. Now she was using it to build something he had never been able to finish. The first 100 posts took 3 days. The next 100 took 2. Then the problems began. Some cores split during drilling. Some absorbed treatment unevenly. A shipment arrived with inconsistent diameters. One customer returned 23 posts. Emily drove to his ranch herself. She expected anger. Instead, the rancher showed her the problem. The posts had split around the holes. Emily crouched beside them. She touched the cracks. They weren't random. Every split began at a knot. Emily's eyes narrowed. She looked back at the stack. Where did these come from? The rancher pointed. Same load. Emily returned to plant. She discovered that the Veneer company was mixing 2 different grades of cores. The higher quality centers were nearly not free. Others contained small defects. For years, nobody had needed to separate them. Now Emily did. She changed the process. Every core will be graded before entering production. Diameter, straightness, knots, cracks, moisture. Then she created 3 grades. The best became structural fence posts. The second became vineyard and orchard stakes. The smallest became landscaping poles. Nothing was wasted. That decision turned a weakness into a system. But it also created another problem. The Veneer plant noticed. Carl Benton called Emily into his office. You've been taking more cores every week. Yes. How many do you need? Emily gave him the number. Carl leaned back. That much material could save us a fortune in disposal. Emily realized what he was saying. The plant no longer wanted her as a customer. They wanted her as a solution. Carl slid a contract across the desk. 10 years of supply, at a fixed price. Emily read it twice. Then she reached the final page. There was one clause that made her stop. The plant wanted the right to terminate the agreement if her company failed to collect a minimum monthly volume. Emily looked up. That means if I grow too slowly, you can cancel. Carl nodded. And if I grow too fast? He smiled. Then we'll have a different problem. Emily signed. Within 6 months, her barn could no longer hold the inventory. The piles moved outside, then beside the orchard, then behind the machine shed. The same neighbors who had laughed began asking questions. Ray Matson was the last. He came over one morning carrying a cup of coffee. You really think this is going somewhere? Emily looked at the rows of finished posts. I think it already has. Ray nodded toward the veneer cores. What happens when everybody realizes what you're doing? Emily paused. She had been thinking about that. I don't know. Ray looked toward the road. A large truck was approaching. It was not one of the veneer plant's trucks. It was a flatbed loaded with ranch fencing supplies. The driver stopped at Emily's gate. A man climbed down. You Emily Carter? Yes. He handed her a clipboard. We got 1,200 posts on order. Emily looked at the paperwork. Her throat tightened. Who ordered them? The driver pointed down the road. 3 ranches, 1 vineyard, and the county fairgrounds. Emily looked at the pile behind her. For 10 years, the veneer plant had dumped those cores onto her land. Now, people were lining up to take them away. But the biggest surprise was still waiting. That afternoon, Susan Keller arrived with a completed laboratory report. She handed Emily the envelope. Your best grade passed. Emily opened it. Her eyes moved down the page. Then stopped. Susan watched her carefully. What? Emily looked up. They tested the post for something I never even considered. What? Emily turned the report around. At the bottom was a durability rating. And beside it was a note about expected service life under properly treated conditions. Emily read it once. Then again. The number was far higher than she had expected. Outside, another veneer truck was already backing through the farm gate. For the first time in 10 years, Emily didn't see waste falling from the truck. She saw the future arriving, and then the driver asked her where he should put the next load. Emily looked across the property. There was nowhere left. Emily looked across the farm. There were peeler cores everywhere, under the barn roof, along the machine shed, stacked beside the orchard, and now another truck was waiting at the gate. For 10 years, she had accepted those loads because nobody had offered her another choice. Now she had a different problem. She needed space. She walked to the old pasture behind the orchard and stopped. The land had once been used for hay. It had poor drainage and an awkward slope that made harvesting difficult. Walter had called it the useless corner. Emily smiled. Not useless, she whispered. By October, the corner had become the Carter Post Yard. She leased a second-hand forklift, bought a used hydraulic post cutter, and hired 2 local men who had been laid off from a sawmill. The Farmall M stayed. Emily refused to sell it. It still started with cough and a violent shake, but every morning its engine rolled across the yard like a reminder that the farm had survived worse things in doubt. The production changed quickly. The best peeler cores were sorted by hand. The ends were squared. The posts were drilled. The wood was treated in batches. Then they were stacked beneath long metal roofs to dry. Emily kept a notebook beside every station. If one post cracked, she wanted to know why. If one batch absorbed treatment differently, she wanted to know why. If a customer complained, she drove to the site herself. She wasn't building a cheap fence post company. She was building a system. And that distinction mattered. By spring 2018, Carter Post had sold more than 18,000 pieces. Emily's first year of sales passed $140,000. Her neighbors stopped calling the cores garbage. They started calling them Carter Posts. That was when the veneer plant changed the rules. Carl Benton called her into his office. We're getting offers for the cores. Emily sat across from him. From who? 2 biomass companies. How much? Carl gave her the number. It was nearly 3 times what Emily had been paying. Her stomach dropped. "If they take them, we're finished," she said. Carl nodded. "I know." Emily looked through the office window. Thousands of cores moved along the plant floor. For years, nobody had wanted them. Now everyone did. She drove home that evening without turning on the radio. The farm was quiet. She walked through the yard until she reached the first prototype fence post. It had been standing for almost a year. She put her hand against it. Still solid, still straight, still holding wire. Then she understood the next step. She couldn't compete by buying waste. She had to compete by creating value. The next morning, Emily returned to Carl with a proposal. She would take the cores for less than the biomass companies offered, but she would take them on a guaranteed schedule. She would remove a fixed volume every week. She would sort them. She would accept material the biomass companies didn't want, and she would sign a long-term contract. Carl studied the proposal. "You're asking us to give you stability." "Yes." "And you're giving us disposal certainty." "Yes." He leaned back. "How much can you take?" Emily looked him directly in the eye. "Everything you can produce." Carl laughed, not the mocking laugh from years earlier. A different one, a surprised laugh. "You can't possibly mean that." Emily nodded. "I do." 6 months later, the contract was signed. The biomass companies walked away. Emily had secured the raw material that had once threatened to bury her farm. Then something unexpected happened. Ranchers began asking for custom sizes. Vineyards wanted thinner stakes. Orchards wanted longer poles. Landscape contractors wanted smooth decorative posts. Fence builders wanted pre-drilled holes. Emily changed the business again. She stopped selling wood. She started selling finished systems. Posts, stakes, braces, garden structures, orchard supports, fence kits. The same material now left the farm in dozens of forms. By 2020, the business had outgrown the original property. Emily bought a small warehouse outside Roseburg. Then another. She hired 12 employees. The Farmall M still worked on the farm, though mostly for sentimental jobs now. The original 20 prototype posts remained around the pear orchard. Emily never replaced them. One evening, Ray Madsen walked to the orchard with her. He stopped beside the oldest post. "I owe you an apology." Emily looked at him. "For what?" "For laughing." She smiled. "You weren't the only one." Ray touched the post. "How much are you selling these for now?" Emily laughed. "That's your first question?" Ray shrugged. "I've got a fence to build." By 2021, the story had spread beyond Douglas County. Agricultural magazines began writing about the young farmer who had turned veneer waste into a rural manufacturing company. A regional fencing supplier signed a distribution agreement. Then another. The numbers became difficult for Emily to ignore. Annual sales passed $300,000, then $400,000, then $500,000. In the 5th year, total company revenue crossed $500,000. Emily sat alone in the farmhouse kitchen when the accountant gave her the final number. She stared at it. $500,000. She didn't celebrate. She opened Walter's old notebook instead. The same notebook Harold had brought to the pasture. The same pages that had once described a failed experiment. Emily turned to the final page. Walter had written one sentence. "Waste is often just material nobody has learned to measure." Emily closed the book. That sentence became the company's motto. But the biggest moment came the following summer. The Veneer plan invited Emily to speak at an industry meeting. She stood in front of executives, engineers, foresters, and manufacturers. They asked her what made the business work. She didn't give them a complicated answer. The material was already good. Someone asked why nobody had discovered it earlier. Emily looked down for a second. "Because everybody was looking at the pile." She paused. "I was looking at the pieces." That sentence was repeated throughout the industry afterward. 5 years after the first post was planted, Emily's farm looked completely different. The neglected orchard had been restored. The old farmhouse roof was new. The barn had been repaired. The machine shed had become a small workshop. And the useless pasture was now the company's first production yard. The peeler cores were no longer dumped randomly. They arrived on scheduled trucks. They were sorted, measured, processed, stacked, sold. The same material that had once embarrassed Emily had become the foundation of a business, employing people from the same communities that had doubted her. Even Harold Pierce changed. He retired from the county and became a consultant for the company. Susan Keller remained involved in quality testing. Frank Bell died before the business reached its biggest year. Emily kept one of his old measuring tools above her desk. Carl Benton eventually visited the farm with a group of Veneer executives. He stood beside the original pile location. Nothing remained there, just grass. He looked at Emily. "You really took all of it?" Emily nodded. Carl laughed softly. 10 years. Emily smiled. 10 years. He looked toward the production yard. "You know what I still can't believe?" "What?" "We used to pay people to haul that material away." Emily looked at the rows of finished posts. "I know." Then she walked toward the orchard. The oldest pear trees were blooming again. The first post she had ever made still stood along the fence. Its surface was weathered. Its grain had darkened, but it remained straight. Emily rested her hand against it. The farm had not been saved by a miracle. It had been saved by observation, by patience, by refusing to believe that something was worthless simply because everyone else had already decided it was. People saw a pile of wooden cores. Emily saw a resource. The land had been trying to tell her for years. She had finally learned how to listen. 10 years after the first truck arrived, Emily's company had generated more than $500,000 in annual revenue, created local jobs, and turned material once treated as waste into a legitimate agricultural product. But Emily still kept the first 20 posts. They stood around the old orchard. No signs, no plaques, no explanations. Just within the ground. At sunrise, the Douglas fir forests beyond the farm were covered in silver mist. The pear blossoms moved gently in the morning breeze. A few birds crossed the fence line. And in the distance, inside the old barn, the Farmall M started on the first crank. Emily stood beside the orchard gate and listened. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then she looked at the old wooden posts disappearing into the mist. The same kind of post nobody had wanted. The same post that had once arrived as waste. The same post that had changed everything. She smiled and walked toward the orchard as the morning light settled over the farm.